In this video, we're finally ready to create the wire network. We'll have various size wires going around the entire building. We'll have some in the front, on the side, and in the back. Some will be short, and some will be very long. We have a lot of wires to do, so let's go ahead and get started. The technique we're going to use to create these wires is to extrude along a curve. And the first one we're going to create is going to be right here. We'll have a wire coming out of this box right into the building's light. So we're going to create a cylinder, move it over here next to the box, and rotate it 90 degrees. We're going to set subdivision axes to 6, and everything else will be kept at default. Let's go ahead and rotate this on Z 30 degrees, because I don't want to have a flat plane at the top of this wire, but rather this corner edge. Since our wires are going to be very low poly, I want to help the shading of the cylindrical object to appear more round. So by moving that edge so it's pointing to the top, just looks better. But actually in the end it doesn't really matter because our wires are going to be so small that the player is not going to see them up close. But this does matter if you're using very low poly cylinders for larger objects. Let's freeze transformations and reset transform back to world, since we had it on object a few videos back. So hold down Control, Shift, right click hold, and choose world. So this is the cylinder we're going to use to extrude on a curve to create all of our wires. We're going to be reusing this cylinder a lot, so I'm going to move it off to the side, and we'll be duplicating this every time we need to extrude. So let's duplicate it and move it into position for our first wire, which is going to come out from this electrical box and go into the light. So we want to position the cylinder from where the wire is going to come from. Next, we need to create a curve. So go to Create, Curve Tools, and there are one of two curves you want to use: a CV curve or an EP curve. EP stands for Edit Points, and CV stands for Control Vertex. In the end, the curve that gets created is the same. The method in which you create these curves is different. So you can use EP or CV. And for me personally, I like using CV curves. And that's the one we're going to use. So enable CV curve, and let's go to top view. It's very important to begin creating your curves from where they're going to be extruded from. So in that case, we want to start right where the cylinder is, because we're going to extrude the faces of the cylinder along this curve. Left click to begin creating the curve, and continue to left click in certain additional control points. You can also left click, hold, and drag to define the curve angle for that control point. So I'm going to continue left clicking until I get the desired shape of what we want our wire to look like. We don't need to place a lot of control points, just enough until we get the wanted shape. And then press enter to create the curve. Let's go back to perspective view, and all the curves get created on top of the grid. So we need to raise it up, and the pivot point of this curve is at the world origin. So we need to modify the pivot point to be at a control point where we started the curve. So I'm going to hold down D, then C, middle mouse click and drag along the curve all the way down to a control vertex. Hold V, middle mouse click and drag to snap this curve to a center vertex of the cylinder's cap. Now with the curve still selected, right click hold and choose control vertex. Now begin to select each control vertex and position it for how you would want this wire to flow from the starting position to the end. And make sure you place the end, the last control vertex, inside the lamp. This is where the wire is going to end. Once you have reshaped the curve to your liking, let's come back to the cylinder. Switch over to face component mode and select these 6 faces here, the cylinder's front cap. Then hold Shift and right click to select the curve. You should now have the 6 faces and the curve selected. The order of selecting the faces first and then the curve second is very important. Press Ctrl E to extrude. The selected faces will now extrude along the curve, creating the wire shape. All we need to do now is increase the divisions. And we're going to set ours at 4. We can continue to make adjustments to the shape of this wire by selecting the curve and then selecting the curve vertices and moving them around. This will update the extruded shape. So let's go ahead and do that by moving the end more into the light and then making sure that the shape of the wire is not intersecting with the light's bracket. If we delete history on the extruded shape, we will remove dependency between the curve and the extrusion. So we will no longer be able to modify the control vertices of the curve and influence the shape of the wire. So what you could do is not delete history if you know you're going to modify the shape later. But in our case, and what I usually do, is once I'm happy with how the extrusion went and the shape, I go ahead and delete history. So that is what we're going to do. We already have history deleted on this wire, and let's continue to finish this up. We need to make a few adjustments by deleting a few faces in the beginning where this wire was extruded from. Then let's move these vertices in so they intersect the box and adjust these vertices a bit. We also need to delete the faces on the other cap since we won't see them. Switch back to Object Component mode, and we're going to set soft edges on this entire mesh. Hold Shift, right click hold, go Soften Harden Edges, and choose Soften Edge. Then set both border edges to a hard edge. Let's adjust these vertices a bit, and we are done with this wire. We do want to keep the CV curve and all the curves we use, just in case we need to recreate it for some reason. So I'm going to select the curve, create a new layer, name it curves, and then add that curve into that layer. Then turn off visibility so we can't see it. We're going to keep adding all of our future curves and store them in this layer. So that is the technique we're going to use for all the wires around the building. Next wire will come out from the bottom of this electrical box and go down the wall just a few feet. Let's duplicate the cylinder, move it into position at the bottom of the electrical box, then create a CV curve, and we'll be always creating CV curves in the orthographic viewport. Let's draw one going down, and we can always readjust the curve after we created it. Let's move it into position. As mentioned before, all the curves get created on the grid and their pivot point at the world origin. And here I deselected the curve, and it's often hard to find once you've deselected it. To reselect it, open up the outliner and type in curve. This will filter all of the curves in your scene, and the one we need is curve 2. Let's select it again and move it in front of the building next to the cylinder. We need to modify the pivot for the curve, and we're going to move it to the control vertex where we began creating the curve from. Then snap the curve to the cylinder's center vertice at the bottom cap. I need to readjust the curve at the bottom where the extrusion will end. And we need to point the last control vertex into the wall. So I'm going to modify these really quick. Readjust some of the other control vertices within the curve. And now we can extrude. Come up to the cylinder. Select the faces on the end cap. These 6 faces. Then shift select the curve and press Ctrl E. Increase the divisions until the extrusion looks good. And then if needed, reselect the curve and modify its control points to reshape the extrusion better. We're going to delete history on the mesh. Delete these top faces. Move these vertices up so they intersect with the box. And delete the other faces on the bottom of this wire. Then come in and manually modify some of the other vertices and reposition them into the wall better. Rotate these vertices a bit. And just kind of do a quality check to see what else we need to adjust. This mesh currently contains way too many edges and we just want to optimize it better. So all we need to do is just delete edges that don't contribute to the shape of this wire. Otherwise, it will add to our polygon count. Let's adjust some of these vertices, move them up, and then take the curve and place it in the curves layer. And last, let's enable soft edges in this entire mesh and set the border edges to a hard edge. We are now done with this wire. So we're going to speed this up a little bit because we have a lot of these wires to do. But I hope you're beginning to see the workflow and the use of this technique. Because that's all we're going to do is repeat exact same steps, following exact same workflow that we just did for the two wires. Let's duplicate the cylinder again, move it into position, create a CV curve, go to top view and begin to draw it out. This curve is going to go from the larger electrical box around the corner of the building and into the light. Let's move the curve up and modify the pivot point to be at a beginning control vertex. Snap the curve to the cylinder and reshape the curve to flow better. Make sure to adjust the curve in the perspective viewport to how you would want the wire to be extruded, so create a more interesting shape. And make sure to adjust the end control points to where you would want the extrusion to end. In our case, it's inside the light. Select the cylinder faces, the curve, and extrude. Add as many divisions as you need to create a good shape, good extrusion, and then come back, selecting the curve, and adjusting the control points to make the wire flow better. When the extruded wire looks good, delete history to break the dependency of the curve and the mesh. Place the curve into the curves layer. Delete the faces on each cap that we don't need. Adjust the vertices, position them inside the box and inside the light. And then manually come through, adjusting all the vertices to make sure that they are not overlapping with the building's wall. And also adjust the shape so the wire is positioned better. Set the entire mesh to have soft edges, the border edges to hard edge. Make any adjustments that you think you need. Then optimize the mesh by removing unnecessary edges. Delete history, and we have another wire done. The next wire will go from the large electrical box, curve around the corner of the building, and continue across the entire front and into the electrical box next to the light. This wire so far is going to be the longest wire we create. Later on, we'll create our longest wire, which will run across the back to the side of the building. When you're creating your CV curves, don't worry about how many points that you're placing down to create that curve. Just do as many as you need to get a good shape and a good curve going. Also, when you extrude the cylinder along the curve, add as many divisions as you need to get a good shape. Because you can always come back in and remove the edges when you're done with extrusion. So in the beginning, it's more important to establish good shape for your wire and not worry so much about optimizing. So focus on the shape first, without worrying about the poly count. And then when you're done, come back through and optimize it. As I've mentioned before, I do like to delete history once I'm done shaping the wire. But depending on your circumstances, you may want to keep that dependency intact. So if you know you will come back and have to readjust it, maybe you know you're going to get some feedback and there will be changes made, then don't delete history on the wire. Keep that connection between the curve and the extrusion and only delete it when you know it's pretty much final. and you won't be making any changes. So here we have another wire done. We got a few more to go. So let's just keep going until we have them all completed. This next wire is going to be a short one. It will come out from the large electrical box on the side of the building and connect into the light. Having the template cylinder we created in the very beginning saves us a lot of time. First, we established how many cylindrical sides we wanted and its thickness. And from that point on, we just duplicate to make sure we have the same consistency across all of our wires. The 6 sides we chose is good enough. If we want to go super low poly, we could get away with 4, and the smooth edges would do its best to fake the rounded shape of the wire. And if it's far away from the player, we could get away with 4 sides. But 6 sides tends to work the best in this case, and I didn't want to go 4 and make it way too low. Because if needed, we can always come back and remove a few edges on selected wires to make them lower poly. But to come back and reshape by adding additional edges would be more difficult. The next 2 wires are going to extend from the larger electrical box going down to a small electrical box on the side of the building near the corner. In this step, I create one curve, shape it, and then I duplicate that curve and position right next to it. Then reshape it just slightly to have the bottom extend a little bit further down. So you don't always have to create a new CV curve. You could duplicate an existing curve and then reshape it. The only problem becomes is if that wire is larger than the curve itself, then you may have to add additional control vertices and modify the existing curve, which is a bit more involved. So I usually duplicate the curve when I know they're similar size and similar length, but when I have larger size wires, I just create a whole new curve. And actually, this could be a very quick way to create a wire network. If you have a large set of similar size and length wires, just create one curve, reshape it, then duplicate the curve multiple times and reshape each one. Then duplicate a bunch of template cylinders, position them next to the curves, and extrude each cylinder along the curve. And you can get something very complex going very quickly, especially after you've done a few extrusions along the curve and you know the steps and technique. This process can be duplicated rather quickly. When I have the same object that I have to create over and over again, repeating the same steps, just like what we're doing here, it helps to write those steps down so you can go through them very quickly and get into a rhythm. And that's what I did here. I wrote down the steps that I would have to complete one after another, making sure I don't miss anything. Then after completing a few of these wires, by looking over at every single step, I got into a flow and rhythm where I was doing them automatically, and I got the rest done very quickly. The next wire created is positioned between 2 small electrical boxes, and it extends from the back of the building around the corner down to the side next to the stairs. There's an added dimension to creating this curve because not only do we have to go around the corner, but we need to curve down to the bottom. And to do this, we first create the curve in top view, and when the curve changes directions to go down the wall, we need to switch over to side view. And since the curve is always created on the grid, we have to continue creating our curve without looking how far it needs to extend down. So I just added a bunch of control vertices going down, and then we repeat the same steps by moving the curve up and modifying control vertices more accurately. So in the previous video, we created the electrical boxes first. And that was a very important preparation step prior to creating the wires. It speeds up the process when you know where the wire has to begin from and where it will end. We have a clear sense of purpose and direction, where we need to begin the curve, how it's going to flow, and where it will be positioned. Where these wires are positioned all came from photo reference. So again, just as I mentioned in previous videos, I'm not creating this from my imagination. I am looking at reference at similar buildings and the electrical pipework, wire network, and seeing how these wires connect, how they flow, so everything can be based from the real world. Adding the electrical pipes, the electrical boxes, and the wire. These details really help sell this environment, this building. After we created the windows, added the AC, and the water drain pipe, it already looked good. An additional electrical detail makes the building more believable, so it is a necessary visual element that we had to add, even though it does come at a higher poly count. We now have only 2 wires left to do, and this next one is the longest one we have to create. It will start from the other side of the building, the small electrical box, go up, across, around the corner, all the way down to a small electrical box in the back of the building. Just like for the previous wire, this one is more involved, meaning that we have to create a curve, start an inside view, then switch over to top view, and then to a front view, since this curve takes many different directions from beginning to end. So you just need to take a bit more time and plan it out for how your curve is going to flow, and then take your time and actually create it by switching to proper view so you can see it and create it better. And for these type of wires, it may take you a few times to fully create them. So if it doesn't work the first time, just delete the curve and try it again. When I extruded along this long curve, I had to manually input the divisions and bump it up to 55, just to make sure there was enough geometry to create the wire shape. So again, focus on modeling first and optimizing later. After you extrude along the curve, you will almost always have to come back, modify and adjust the control vertices of the curve to update your wire shape. The important part here is to make sure that the wire polygons are not intersecting with the wall. So you have to get them close enough to make it look like they are right up against it, but not inside it. Also, right after deleting history and breaking the connection between the curve and the extruded polygons, we can do another level of adjustment by going around selecting each set of vertices and move them closer to the wall, making sure they're not overlapping, as well as adjusting 90-degree curves where the wire changes shape and changes direction. Once you smooth all the edges on the wire, make sure to disable wireframe unshaded to check that the wire has smooth shading, and if you need to maybe change or modify a few vertices for more rounded smooth shape. When it comes to optimizing, all we are doing is removing a set of edges that doesn't contribute to the shape of the wire. When we add divisions, this adds a lot of edge loops throughout our entire extrusion, and most of those we do not need. Although we do want to leave a few edges in that will help to break up straight lines on the wire. This adds more imperfection, which helps with realism. We now have one more wire to create, and it's going to be here on the side of the building, extending from the square electrical box, going up to the small box. So I'm going to cover and run through the steps to reinforce the technique. Duplicate and position the template cylinder where the wire is going to be extruded from. Then create a CV curve in any of the orthographic viewports. Left click to begin, then continue to left click, adding additional control vertices. You can left click, hold, and drag to add a control vertex and adjust the angle of the curve. To do this, you have to add the first 3 control vertices, and then you'll be able to change the angle. Then press enter to create the curve. Move the curve up to place it into position, and modify the pivot point. I recommend placing this pivot point in the same location where you began creating the curve. The starting point of the curve is very important. You want to snap that point to the center of the cylinder from where you will be extruding from. Adjust the control vertices on the curve if needed. Then select the faces in the cylinder that you want to extrude. Then select the curve. So select the faces first, the curve second. Press Ctrl E to extrude along the curve and increase the divisions. Adjust the curve if needed to update the extrusion. And if everything looks good, we're going to delete history to remove the influence of the curve to the extruded shape. Add the curve to our layer. Delete the faces on the wire that we are not going to see. Modify vertices if needed to push them inside the object where they're coming from. Then modify further by selecting edges or vertices to adjust the shape. Remove unnecessary edges that don't add to the shape of the wire. Smooth all edges and harden border edges. Disable wireframe unshaded. Take a look. If everything's okay and it looks great, then delete history and freeze transformations. Alright, we are finally done with the wires. This took some time to create because there were so many of them, but in the end it will be worth it. These are going to look great.